For more than half a century, the United States government has insisted on one simple fact. 3 men died in the freezing waters of San Francisco Bay on a June night in 1962. No bodies were ever recovered. No proof was ever found. And yet, for 55 years, that was the official story everyone was told to accept. Then a piece of software with no opinion, no agenda, and no stake in protecting anyone's reputation looked at an old photograph and reached a very different conclusion. This is the story of how modern artificial intelligence quietly reopened one of the most famous unsolved cases in American history, and why the answer it found is still too explosive for the FBI to admit out loud. Alcatraz Island sits in the middle of San Francisco Bay, surrounded by water so cold it can induce hypothermia in under an hour and currents so unpredictable that even experienced swimmers have drowned trying to cross them. When the federal government converted the island into a maximum security penitentiary in 1934, it wasn't just building a prison. It was building a myth. The inmates sent there were the men other prisons couldn't hold. Organized crime figures, serial escape artists, the most dangerous inventory of the American penal system. The message to the public was simple. Nobody leaves the rock. For nearly 3 decades, that message held. Dozens of men attempted escape across more than a dozen separate incidents. Most were recaptured within hours. A few were shot. A couple drowned in plain sight of the guards. And 5, over the prison's entire operational history, were never found again, officially presumed dead, unofficially the subject of endless speculation. Alcatraz closed in 1963, largely because it had become too expensive to run. But before it shut its doors, it produced the one story that has outlived the prison itself by 60 years. Frank Morris was not an ordinary convict. Orphaned as a child and raised largely by the foster system, he developed an IQ that later testing placed well above average, and he used that intelligence the way other men used muscle. He had already broken out of a Louisiana prison once before landing at Alcatraz, which is precisely why the federal government sent him there in the first place. They wanted him somewhere he couldn't think his way out of. But thinking his way out was exactly what Morris intended to do. He didn't work alone. Clarence and John England, brothers from a sprawling family of Florida sharecroppers, joined the plan. The Englands had grown up swimming in the rough, open water of the Gulf Coast, hauling nets and working the currents long before either of them ever robbed a bank. To most people, the idea of paddling across San Francisco Bay at night sounded like suicide. To the Englands, cold water was simply the water they'd grown up in. A fourth conspirator, Alan West, helped design and coordinate the plan from the very beginning, contributing as much labor and planning as any of the 3 men who ultimately vanished. What these 4 men accomplished over the better part of a year remains one of the most meticulous prison breaks ever documented. Working at night, they used sharpened spoons, a homemade drill fashioned from a stolen vacuum motor, and sheer patience to enlarge the ventilation grates at the back of their cells, small, unremarkable openings that led into an unused utility corridor behind their cell block. Morris reportedly used his nightly accordion practice to mask the sound of scraping metal, turning a hobby into cover for a crime. To buy themselves time once they were gone, the men built dummy heads to leave in their beds, sculpted from soap, toilet paper, concrete dust, and real human hair collected from the prison barbershop floor, then painted to match skin tone under dim light. From the utility corridor, they climbed to the roof of the cell block and down the far side of the building, out of sight of the patrolling guards. For away across the bay itself, they turned more than 50 stolen prison-issue raincoats into a crude raft and life preservers, gluing and stitching the seams together with contact cement smuggled out of the workshops, where some of the inmates were assigned. It was improvised, fragile, and completely dependent on the weather holding. On the night of June 11th, 1962, Morris and the England brothers squeezed through their enlarged vents, made their way to the roof, and disappeared into the dark. Alan West's own opening wasn't quite finished in time. By the moment he finally broke through, the others were already gone, and he was left behind to face the consequences alone. The 3 men inflated their makeshift raft, reportedly using a small accordion as an improvised air pump, and pushed off into water that had defeated every other Alcatraz escapee in the prison's history. The following morning, A guard doing the standard early head count reached into Frank Morris's cell and discovered the dummy head sitting where a living man should have been. Within minutes, the alarm was raised, and one of the largest manhunts in American law enforcement history began, stretching across the bay, up and down the coastline, and eventually across state lines as tips and sightings poured in from around the country. Searchers eventually recovered fragments of the raft and a waterproofed packet belonging to the Anglin brothers containing family photographs and contact information. What they never found, despite an exhaustive search, was a single body. In 1979, 17 years after the escape, the FBI formally closed its investigation and issued its conclusion. Morris and the Anglin brothers had drowned within minutes of entering the bay, their bodies swept out through the Golden Gate and lost to the open ocean. It was a clean, tidy ending, and it conveniently preserved the reputation Alcatraz had spent 30 years building, the idea that the prison truly was inescapable, and that anyone who tried to prove otherwise paid with their life. The public was never fully convinced. San Francisco Bay, while genuinely dangerous, is not the instant death sentence federal officials described. In 1955, endurance swimmer Jack Laland swam the same route in handcuffs at the age of 41, then repeated the feat at 60 while towing a half-ton boat and wearing shackles. Today, thousands of amateur athletes cross those same waters every year during the escape from Alcatraz Triathlon, and in 2006 a swimmer as young as 7 successfully completed the crossing. The water that supposedly guaranteed the men's deaths was, under the right conditions, entirely survivable, even for people with far less motivation and far less familiarity with open water than 3 desperate escapees, 2 of whom had spent their entire childhoods swimming rough coastal currents. The real challenge to the official story didn't come from conspiracy theorists. It came from a team of coastal engineers at Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands, who in 2014 were building a highly detailed hydraulic model of San Francisco Bay for an unrelated study on rising sea levels. Realizing their model could answer a 60-year-old question almost by accident, researchers Olivier Hose, Rolf Hutt, and Fedor Bart reprogrammed their simulation to recreate the tidal and current conditions of the exact night of the escape, then released a series of virtual rafts from Alcatraz at staggered intervals to see where the physics would take them. The results were unforgiving in one direction and surprisingly favorable in the other. Any raft launched significantly before roughly 11:30 p.m. was swept directly through the Golden Gate and out into the open Pacific Ocean, a death sentence, exactly as the FBI had always claimed. But a raft launched within a narrow window between approximately 11:30 p.m. and midnight rode the outgoing tide north instead of west, carrying it toward the shoreline near Horseshoe Bay, just past the Golden Gate Bridge and well within reach of dry land. The men's survival, according to the simulation, may have come down to a window of roughly 30 minutes. Then came the detail that made investigators take the model seriously. The simulation showed that any debris washing ashore near Horseshoe Bay would naturally drift back across the bay to a very specific location, Angel Island. That is the exact spot where searchers in 1962 recovered fragments of the escapees' raft and their waterproof packet of photographs. In other words, the very wreckage the FBI had cited as proof of drowning was, according to the physics, equally consistent with a successful landing followed by drifting debris. The evidence used to close the case as a drowning fit just as well, arguably better, with a story of survival. Adding weight to the theory was an unlikely source, Boston organized crime boss James Whitey Bulger, who served time on Alcatraz alongside the Anglin brothers before his release. Years later, Bulger wrote that he had personally coached the brothers on how to read the bay's tides and currents, and that they had executed the escape precisely according to that guidance. Some accounts even suggest an accomplice met the men partway with a small boat, though no such vessel was ever recovered. The water, it increasingly appeared, had not been the impenetrable barrier the government wanted the public to believe. For decades, the Anglin family maintained, quietly and consistently, that the brothers were alive. Their reasons were more than wishful thinking. For 3 years after the escape, Christmas cards signed by John and Clarence arrived at their mother's home carrying no postmark whatsoever, as though they had been delivered by hand rather than mailed through the postal system. Anonymous bouquets of roses appeared at her home every year until her death in 1973, and family members later claimed that two unusually tall men, faces obscured by heavy makeup, stood at the back of the funeral and left without speaking to anyone. A similar incident was reported in 1989 at their father's burial. None of it constituted proof. All of it was strange enough to keep the family's belief alive for generations. In 2013, more than 50 years after the escape, a letter arrived at a San Francisco police station signed John England. It claimed that all three men had survived the crossing, that Frank Morris had died in 2008 and Clarence in 2011, and that the writer, now 83 and suffering from cancer, was willing to surrender in exchange for reduced prison time and a public acknowledgement on television. That acknowledgement never came. The U.S. Marshals Service confirmed that the FBI laboratory tested the letter's handwriting against known samples from all three men, along with available fingerprint and DNA evidence. Every result came back inconclusive, not disproven, simply unresolved, in a case that seemed determined to resist a definitive answer at every turn. Perhaps the single most important piece of evidence had been sitting in a family photo album since the mid-1970s. Fred Britzi, a man who had grown up near the England family in Florida, claimed he encountered the brothers on a dirt road in Brazil more than a decade after their supposed deaths and took their picture. He gave the photograph to the England family in 1992. Both men in the image wore dark aviator sunglasses, obscuring the exact facial features that traditional identification methods rely on most. In 2015, family members brought the photo to retired U.S. Marshal Art Roderick, who had pursued the case for 2 decades. He considered it a potentially decisive piece of evidence. A forensic consultant he worked with called a match between the men in the photo and the England brothers highly plausible. But not everyone agreed. A separate deputy marshal, who had also investigated the case for years, argued that measurements taken from the photograph didn't align with the brothers' known physical proportions. The case remained exactly where it had been for decades, tantalizing but unproven. That stalemate is where artificial intelligence entered the story. In 2020, a facial recognition system built by a machine learning firm and deployed as part of a creative advertising campaign was applied to the decades-old Brazil photograph. Unlike earlier forensic attempts, the system wasn't dependent on visible eyes or fully